Get out of the car now. Keep your hands where I can see them." Officer Brett Sullivan's voice cut through the humid Georgia air like a blade. His hand rested on his weapon, fingers twitching with barely contained aggression. It was 2:43 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon along Highway 341, just outside Fort Stewart. The late summer sun blazed mercilessly on the asphalt, creating heat waves that distorted the view of the sprawling military installation in the distance. Major Candace Freeman sat perfectly still behind the wheel of her silver Honda Accord. Her military bearing was evident even in civilian clothes. A crisp white button-down shirt, pressed navy slacks, and not a hair out of place despite the Georgia heat. The base parking sticker on her windshield gleamed in the sunlight. Fort Stewart authorized personnel. The eagle and star insignia clearly visible to anyone who bothered to look. Officer Sullivan hadn't bothered to look. "Step out of the vehicle immediately." His voice grew louder, more aggressive. "This is your final warning." Candace's hands remained on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Her breathing stayed controlled, measured. 15 years of military training had taught her to maintain composure under pressure. "Officer, may I ask why I was stopped?" Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, though she kept it respectful. Sullivan's face flushed red above his collar. "Don't question me. I said get out of the car." A white pickup truck had pulled over about 50 yards ahead. The driver, Tiffany Brooks, had initially stopped to check her phone for directions. Now she found herself witnessing something that made her stomach turn. Tiffany activated her phone's camera and began recording. The timestamp read 2:44 p.m. Real-life stories like this happen more often than we'd like to admit. Have you ever been judged based on assumptions rather than facts? These touching stories remind us why justice and accountability still matter in America today. Officer Sullivan approached the driver's side window with the swagger of someone who'd never had his authority questioned. At 34, he'd been with the Richmond County Sheriff's Department for 8 years. His record showed a pattern of aggressive stops, but nothing that had ever stuck. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle right now." Candace's tone remained steady. "Officer Sullivan, I'm complying with all traffic laws. Could you please explain the reason for this stop?" The question hit Sullivan like a personal challenge. His jaw clenched and his hand moved closer to his weapon. "You were speeding," he said, though his radar gun remained clipped to his belt, unused. "What was my speed, officer?" The simple question exposed the lie immediately. Sullivan had no reading because he'd never checked. The stop was based on something else entirely. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Step out of the car or I'll remove you myself." Tiffany's phone screen showed 12 people watching her live stream. The number climbed rapidly as she typed, "Police stop gone wrong on Highway 341. This looks bad." Comments began appearing. "Someone needs to help." "Is this really happening? Call someone." Candace slowly reached for her door handle, her movements deliberate and visible. "I'm exiting the vehicle, officer. My hands are in plain sight." She stepped onto the asphalt with the same composed dignity she brought to military courtrooms. At 41, Major Freeman had prosecuted dozens of cases as a JAG officer. She understood the law better than most judges. "Turn around," Sullivan commanded. "Hands behind your head." "Officer, I haven't committed any offense that would warrant this treatment." The statement was factual, calm, and completely accurate. It also enraged Sullivan further. "You're resisting lawful commands," he declared loudly, clearly performing for an imaginary audience. Candace complied with the position request while maintaining her composure. "Officer Sullivan, I'm fully cooperating. Could you please state the specific violation that initiated this stop?" The legal precision of her language should have been a warning. Military personnel, especially officers, spoke differently than civilians. The structured phrasing, the proper pronunciation, the absence of contractions. Sullivan heard challenge where others might have heard professionalism. "You think you're better than me?" He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Think your fancy car and attitude make you special?" The Honda Accord was 3 years old with 47,000 miles. Nothing fancy about it except regular maintenance and cleanliness. But in Sullivan's mind, it represented something that triggered his deepest resentments. Tiffany's viewer count hit 23. Someone had shared the stream link, and comments were flooding in faster than she could read them. "This is racial profiling." "Someone call the local news." "Get his badge number." A second vehicle had stopped behind Tiffany's truck. Jerome Matthews, a Fort Stewart civilian contractor, recognized the scene immediately. He'd witnessed similar stops before. This one felt different, more dangerous. Jerome activated his dash cam and stepped out of his car, phone in hand. "Hey, officer, everything all right here?" His voice carried across the hot asphalt. Sullivan spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Get back in your vehicle. This doesn't concern you." "I'm just checking if everyone's safe, officer." The presence of witnesses should have de-escalated the situation. Instead, Sullivan felt cornered, challenged by multiple people questioning his authority. "Ma'am," Sullivan addressed Candace with exaggerated courtesy that dripped with sarcasm, "you're going to assume the position against your vehicle for a safety search." "Officer, on what legal grounds?" Candace asked quietly. The question was perfectly reasonable. Traffic stops required reasonable suspicion of criminal activity for searches beyond license and registration checks. No such suspicion existed here. Sullivan's response was to grab Candace's arm and attempt to force her toward the car. The physical contact changed everything. Major Candace Freeman had spent 15 years in the United States Army. She'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, commanded military police units, and prosecuted cases involving assault on federal officers. Her body was trained to respond to physical threats. Her reaction was immediate and controlled. She twisted away from Sullivan's grip using a defensive technique taught in military police training. The movement was textbook perfect, designed to break contact without escalating violence. To Sullivan, it looked like resistance. "She's fighting," he shouted, though the statement was objectively false. Tiffany's phone captured everything: the improper grab, Candace's defensive response, Sullivan's dramatic overreaction. Her viewer count had reached 67 and climbing. Comments exploded across the screen. "He grabbed her first. She didn't fight him. This cop is out of control." Sullivan radioed for backup, his voice tight with manufactured urgency. "Unit 347 requesting immediate assistance. Subject is resisting arrest, possibly combative." The radio crackled with responses. Multiple units began converging on Highway 341. "Officer, I am not resisting," Candace stated clearly. "I used a defensive technique to prevent injury when you grabbed me improperly." The legal language was precise, creating a record for any future proceedings. Every word calculated to establish the factual timeline. Jerome's phone was also recording now, 2 cameras capturing the same incident from different angles, creating comprehensive documentation. "Officer Sullivan, I've got this on video," Jerome called out. "Everything's being recorded." The statement should have encouraged better behavior. Instead, Sullivan seemed to double down on his aggressive approach. "Put your hands behind your back," he commanded, producing handcuffs. "Am I under arrest?" Candace asked. Sullivan hesitated. He had no legitimate grounds for arrest. No crime had been committed, no traffic violation occurred, no evidence of wrongdoing existed. "Yes," he said anyway. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer." The charge was legally baseless, but Sullivan was committed to his course of action now. What is the underlying offense that led to this arrest? Candace's question cut straight to the heart of the legal problem Sullivan faced. He had no answer because there was no underlying offense. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. 2 additional patrol cars were responding to Sullivan's backup call, their emergency lights flashing in the afternoon sun. Tiffany's live stream had reached 134 viewers. Someone with journalist in their bio had joined and was screen recording everything. "This is about to go viral," one comment read. "Someone needs to identify that cop." Deputy Rebecca Stone arrived first, her patrol car sliding to a stop behind Sullivan's vehicle. At 29, she'd been with Richmond County for 4 years and had developed a reputation for level-headed policing. Stone immediately assessed the scene. 1 officer, 1 civilian, 2 witnesses recording, no apparent criminal activity. Her training kicked in. "What's the situation?" she asked Sullivan. "Traffic stop. Subject became combative," Sullivan reported breathlessly. Stone looked at Candace, who stood calmly with her hands visible, showing no signs of combativeness or aggression. "Ma'am, are you injured?" Stone asked. "No, officer. I'm completely unharmed and have been cooperative throughout this encounter." The professional language registered with Stone immediately. This wasn't a typical traffic stop subject. "What was the initial violation?" Stone asked Sullivan. "Speeding," he replied, though his radar gun remained unused on his belt. Stone noticed the discrepancy but didn't address it in front of the witnesses. The second backup unit arrived carrying Detective Laura Bennett. At 38, Bennett had 15 years of experience and instincts that rarely failed her. She took one look at the scene and knew something was wrong. The civilian stood with military bearing, spoke with educated precision, and showed none of the signs of someone actually resisting arrest. The primary officer seemed agitated and uncertain. Bennett approached the witnesses first. "Sir, could you tell me what you observed?" she asked Jerome. Officer grabbed the lady's arm when she asked about legal grounds for searching her car. She moved away defensively, and he claimed she was fighting him. The account was clear and specific. Bennett looked at Tiffany, who was still live streaming. "Same thing," Tiffany confirmed. "I got it all on video." He grabbed her first. Bennett walked over to Candace, who maintained her composed posture despite being handcuffed. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Major Candace Freeman, United States Army JAG Corps." The words hit the assembled officers like a physical blow. JAG Corps, Judge Advocate General, military lawyers, the people who prosecuted court-martials and understood federal law better than most civilian attorneys. Bennett immediately recognized the catastrophic legal implications of the situation. Sullivan's face went pale. He'd just arrested a military officer who specialized in prosecuting cases involving law enforcement misconduct. "Ma'am, what was your destination today?" Bennett asked. Already knowing the answer would make things worse. "I was returning to Fort Stewart from a legal conference in Savannah. I'm scheduled to brief the base commander at 1600 hours on new federal regulations regarding civilian law enforcement interaction with military personnel." The irony was devastating. Sullivan had arrested the exact person responsible for training military personnel on dealing with problematic police interactions. Bennett looked at Sullivan with a mixture of pity and professional horror. "Uncuff her," she said quietly. "But she resisted," Sullivan protested weakly. "Uncuff her now," Bennett repeated, her voice carrying the authority of someone who outranked him. Tiffany's live stream had reached 298 viewers. The comment section was moving too fast to read, filled with outrage, legal analysis from viewers who recognized the military terminology, and demands for accountability. As the handcuffs came off, Candace rubbed her wrists slowly. The marks were visible, creating photographic evidence of the improper detention. Major Freeman, Detective Bennett said formally, I apologize for this incident. We'll need to complete a report. Detective, I understand you have procedures to follow. I'm prepared to provide a complete statement. Bennett appreciated the professional courtesy, but she knew this incident was far beyond normal reporting procedures. The sound of another engine approached. A black SUV with government plates pulled up behind the patrol cars. Colonel James Harrison stepped out, his expression unreadable. The base commander had been monitoring radio traffic when reports of an incident involving military personnel reached his attention. At 52, Harrison had commanded Fort Stewart for 3 years. He'd dealt with civilian police interactions before, but never anything like this. Major Freeman, the colonel said, approaching the group. Colonel Harrison, Candace replied, coming to attention despite the circumstances. Are you injured? No, sir, I'm unharmed. Good. He turned to Detective Bennett. Detective, what happened here? Bennett looked at Sullivan, who seemed to shrink under the colonel's gaze. There appears to have been a misunderstanding, sir. The diplomatic language couldn't hide the reality. Everyone present understood that a federal officer had been illegally detained by local police. Harrison's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Pentagon. News traveled fast in military circles, especially when it involved JAG officers and potential civil rights violations. Excuse me, Harrison answered the call. His conversation was brief but decisive. Yes, sir. Understood. Full investigation. Yes, sir. We'll handle it appropriately. He ended the call and addressed the group. Major Freeman, you're to report to base immediately for a full debrief. Detective Bennett will need to coordinate a joint investigation. Sullivan finally found his voice. Sir, I was just doing my job. Colonel Harrison's stare could have melted steel. Son, Major Freeman prosecutes cases involving misconduct by law enforcement personnel. She knows the law better than anyone here. The weight of Sullivan's mistake was becoming clear to everyone present. Major Freeman specializes in federal civil rights cases, Harrison continued. She's testified before Congress on police accountability measures. She's literally the worst possible person you could have chosen for this kind of treatment. Tiffany ended her live stream at 3:17 p.m. Her final viewer count was 1,247, and the video had been shared across multiple platforms. The footage would be analyzed by legal experts, civil rights attorneys, and federal investigators within hours. As Candace prepared to leave with Colonel Harrison, she addressed Detective Bennett professionally. Detective, I'll be filing a formal complaint through appropriate military and civilian channels. This incident will be thoroughly investigated. I understand, ma'am. We'll cooperate fully. Sullivan stood alone beside his patrol car, finally comprehending the magnitude of his error. He'd just created a federal incident involving a high-ranking military officer who possessed the legal expertise to ensure maximum consequences for his actions. The base sticker he'd ignored told a story he should have read carefully, but like so many others, he'd made assumptions based on appearance rather than facts. Those assumptions were about to cost him everything. The conference room on the 3rd floor of Building 298 at Fort Stewart buzzed with controlled urgency. At 4:15 p.m., 32 minutes after the scheduled briefing time, Major Candace Freeman sat at the polished oak table surrounded by the most senior military and civilian leadership in southeast Georgia. Colonel Harrison presided over the emergency session. To his right sat Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, staff judge, advocate for the 3rd Infantry Division. Across the table, FBI Special Agent Monica Davis represented federal law enforcement interest in the case. The Richmond County Sheriff's Department had sent Captain Ryan Mitchell, Sullivan's immediate supervisor. At 45, Mitchell had 22 years of law enforcement experience and the uncomfortable task of explaining how one of his officers had created a federal incident. "Major Freeman," Colonel Harrison began, "please provide your complete account of today's events." Candace opened her leather portfolio with the same precision she brought to military courtrooms. Her account was chronological, detailed, and devastating in its legal implications. At approximately 14:45 hours, I was traveling northbound on Highway 341, returning from a legal conference in Savannah. I observed a Richmond County Sheriff's Patrol vehicle behind me for approximately 2 miles before emergency lights were activated. She continued methodically, describing each element of the stop with the precision of someone who understood exactly which details mattered for legal proceedings. The initial stop lacked probable cause. No traffic violations occurred, no equipment failures were apparent, and my vehicle displayed proper military installation access credentials. Special Agent Davis took notes as Candace described Officer Sullivan's escalating behavior. When I inquired about the reason for the stop, Officer Sullivan became increasingly aggressive. He demanded I exit the vehicle without providing legal justification and threatened physical removal when I asked for clarification. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned forward. "Major, in your professional opinion, did Officer Sullivan's actions constitute a violation of your civil rights?" "Yes, ma'am. The stop, detention, and arrest violated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. The physical contact constituted assault under both state and federal statutes." Captain Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd reviewed Sullivan's personnel file during the drive to Fort Stewart and discovered a pattern of questionable stops that had somehow never resulted in formal discipline. The social media documentation created additional complications. Tiffany's live stream had been shared 3,847 times across various platforms. Local news stations were already requesting interviews. Dr. Washington's story proves that one person's response to injustice can transform entire institutions. Major Freeman's case would similarly test whether accountability systems actually functioned when challenged by clear evidence of misconduct. Colonel Harrison addressed Captain Mitchell directly. "Captain, what is Officer Sullivan's disciplinary history?" Mitchell consulted his file reluctantly. 17 complaints in 8 years of service, mostly involving traffic stops and use of force incidents. No sustained violations. 17 complaints with no sustained violations suggested systematic problems with the department's internal affairs process. Special Agent Davis looked up from her notes. "Captain Mitchell, were any of those complaints investigated by external agencies?" "No, ma'am. All handled internally." The admission revealed a department that policed itself without outside oversight, creating conditions where misconduct could flourish unchecked. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes pulled up federal case law on her tablet. "The pattern described here suggests deliberate indifference to civil rights violations. Under Section 1983, both Officer Sullivan and Richmond County could face significant liability." Major Freeman had remained quiet during this exchange, but her legal expertise was clearly influencing the discussion's direction. Colonel Harrison made the first decisive move. "Major Freeman, I'm ordering a complete legal review of this incident. You'll coordinate with FBI and Department of Justice investigators to ensure full federal prosecution if warranted." "Sir, given my personal involvement, I should recuse myself from any prosecutorial decisions." "Negative, Major. Your expertise in civil rights law makes you essential to this investigation. We'll address conflicts of interest through proper channels." The decision meant Major Freeman would help build the federal case against the officer who'd arrested her. The irony was profound, but legally appropriate. Captain Mitchell attempted damage control. Colonel Harrison, Officer Sullivan is a good officer who made an error in judgment. Perhaps we could resolve this through internal discipline and additional training. The suggestion fell flat in the face of recorded evidence and legal analysis. Captain, Special Agent Davis interjected, this isn't an error in judgment. This is a pattern of civil rights violations that created a federal incident involving a military officer. The FBI's involvement elevated the case beyond local politics and police department loyalties. At 4:47 p.m., Major Freeman's phone buzzed with messages from colleagues across the military legal system. Word was spreading through JAG networks about the Highway 341 incident. One text came from Brigadier General Sandra Cooper, who commanded all Army JAG operations in the Southeast. The message was brief but clear. Full support. Maximum accountability. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes pulled up the live stream footage on the conference room's main screen. Watching the incident unfold from multiple camera angles reinforced how legally indefensible Sullivan's actions had been. The video shows clear escalation by Officer Sullivan, Hayes observed. Major Freeman maintained professionalism throughout the encounter, while being subjected to increasingly aggressive treatment. Captain Mitchell watched his officer's career evaporate in real time. The footage left no room for alternative interpretations or mitigating circumstances. Special Agent Davis asked the critical question, Major Freeman, what outcome are you seeking through federal prosecution? Major Freeman considered her response carefully. Her personal desires for justice had to be balanced against the broader implications for military-civilian relations. Agent Davis, I want accountability that prevents future incidents. Officer Sullivan's actions weren't isolated mistakes. They were part of a pattern enabled by inadequate oversight. She paused, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of legal experience. This case represents an opportunity to establish clear precedent that military personnel have the same constitutional protections as any American citizen. The statement framed the incident in constitutional terms that extended far beyond personal grievance. Colonel Harrison recognized the broader implications. Major Freeman, this case could influence how civilian law enforcement interacts with military personnel nationwide. Yes, sir, that's exactly why proper prosecution is essential. At 5:15 p.m., the meeting adjourned with clear directives. FBI would launch a civil rights investigation. Fort Stewart would coordinate full cooperation with federal prosecutors. Richmond County would conduct its own internal investigation, though everyone understood that process would be largely meaningless given the federal involvement. Captain Mitchell left the meeting knowing that Officer Sullivan's employment was effectively over. The only question remaining was whether he'd face criminal charges or simply lose his job. Special Agent Davis began making calls before she reached her car. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Georgia needed to be briefed immediately. Civil rights cases involving law enforcement required careful handling and experienced attorneys. Major Freeman returned to her office in Building 35, where her paralegal, Staff Sergeant Denzel Hayes, had been fielding calls from media outlets for 2 hours. Major, the Washington Post wants a statement. CNN requested an interview. Local news stations have called 6 times. Handle all media requests. Through public affairs, Sergeant Hayes, this is now a federal investigation, requiring careful coordination. Hayes understood the implications. High-profile civil rights cases attracted national attention and political complications. Major Freeman spent the evening reviewing relevant case law and federal statutes. Her personal experience as a victim would inform her professional analysis of the legal issues involved. The precedent cases were encouraging for prosecution. Recent federal courts had become increasingly willing to hold individual officers accountable for civil rights violations. Monroe v. Pape established that police officers couldn't hide behind official duties when violating constitutional rights. Graham v. Connor defined standards for reasonable use of force. Hope v. Pelzer confirmed that obvious constitutional violations couldn't be excused by lack of specific precedent. Officer Sullivan's actions clearly violated established constitutional standards, creating a strong foundation for federal prosecution. At 8:23 p.m., Major Freeman received a call from her mentor, Colonel David Martinez, who served in the Pentagon's Office of General Counsel. "Candace, I heard about the incident. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, sir. More concerned about the broader implications than personal impact." "That's what I figured. Listen, this case is getting attention at the highest levels. The Secretary of Defense is monitoring the situation personally. The information carried both support and pressure. Success or failure would be scrutinized by the military's senior leadership." "Sir, I understand the stakes. We'll handle this appropriately." "I know you will. But Candace, don't let the politics overshadow the personal aspect. You were wronged, and that matters regardless of the broader implications." The reminder was important. Major Freeman's professional obligations couldn't completely override her personal rights as a victim of civil rights violations. Meanwhile, across Richmond County, Officer Sullivan was discovering the consequences of his actions through social media coverage. The live stream footage had been viewed over 100,000 times. News outlets were identifying him by name and publishing his employment history. The 17 previous complaints were now public knowledge. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters requesting statements. Sullivan's union representative had advised complete silence while lawyers reviewed the case. Deputy Rebecca Stone, who'd responded to the backup call, was also facing scrutiny. Her body camera footage showed her professional handling of the situation, but she'd still been present during a federal civil rights violation. Stone spent the evening writing a detailed report of her observations, knowing that her account could be crucial for prosecution or defense depending on its contents. Detective Laura Bennett faced similar pressure. Her investigation would determine Richmond County's official response to the incident and influence federal prosecution decisions. Bennett had already identified the key legal problems with Sullivan's actions: the lack of probable cause for the initial stop, the improper escalation to physical contact, and the baseless arrest created multiple federal violations. Her preliminary report, completed at 9:45 p.m., recommended immediate termination and referral for federal prosecution. Captain Mitchell read Bennett's recommendations with growing concern. The department faced potential federal oversight, massive civil liability, and devastating public relations consequences. At 10:17 p.m., Sheriff Thomas Reynolds called an emergency meeting with senior staff. The elected official had spent 26 years building his political career and recognized the existential threat posed by the federal investigation. "This incident could destroy everything we've worked to build," Reynolds told his assembled command staff. "We need to get ahead of it with decisive action." The political calculations were obvious. Swift accountability for Sullivan might limit broader damage to the department and Reynolds's upcoming re-election campaign. Meanwhile, at Fort Stewart, Major Freeman continued her legal analysis. Federal civil rights prosecutions required proof that defendants acted willfully to deprive citizens of constitutional rights. Sullivan's actions easily met that standard. The recorded evidence showed deliberate escalation despite clear indicators that no criminal activity was occurring. The case law was equally supportive. United States v. Lanier established that officers could be prosecuted for violating clearly established constitutional rights, even without specific precedent covering identical circumstances. Every element of Sullivan's behavior had been clearly established as unconstitutional by decades of federal court decisions. At 11:34 p.m., Major Freeman received a text message from Tiffany Brooks, the witness who'd live-streamed the incident. "Major Freeman, I wanted you to know that I'm willing to testify if needed. What happened to you was wrong, and I'm glad I recorded it." The civilian support was encouraging. Witness cooperation would be essential for successful prosecution. Jerome Matthews, the second witness, had also contacted military authorities through Fort Stewart's Public Affairs Office. His dash cam footage provided additional evidence from a different angle. The combination of multiple camera angles, witness testimony, and Major Freeman's legal expertise created an unusually strong foundation for federal prosecution. As Thursday evening turned into Friday morning, the incident's consequences were spreading beyond Richmond County and Fort Stewart. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division was reviewing the case file. FBI agents were interviewing witnesses. Military legal officers across the country were discussing the implications for future civilian law enforcement interactions. Officer Sullivan's 17-complaint history was being analyzed by federal pattern and practice investigators looking for broader civil rights violations within Richmond County Sheriff's Department. The single traffic stop had evolved into a comprehensive federal investigation with implications extending far beyond one officer's misconduct. Major Freeman understood that her case would influence how military personnel were treated by civilian police for years to come. The responsibility was both personal and professional. Justice required not just accountability for Officer Sullivan, but systematic changes that would prevent future violations. The investigation was just beginning, but the evidence was overwhelming. Federal prosecution was inevitable, and Major Freeman would play a central role in ensuring maximum accountability. Friday morning brought a media circus to Richmond County that Sheriff Thomas Reynolds had never experienced in 26 years of law enforcement. At 6:47 a.m., 3 news vans from Atlanta television stations were setting up outside the Sheriff's Department headquarters. Cable news networks had picked up the story overnight, transforming a local incident into national news. The narrative was irresistible to media outlets. Racist cop arrests military lawyer who specializes in prosecuting police misconduct. The irony wrote itself. Major Freeman arrived at Fort Stewart at 0700 hours to find her office overwhelmed with media requests, legal consultations, and federal coordination requirements. Staff Sergeant Hayes had compiled a stack of messages 3 inches thick. "Major, every news organization in the country wants to interview you. The Justice Department called twice. The Pentagon wants hourly updates." "Handle everything through official channels, Sergeant Hayes. We proceed by military protocol and federal investigation requirements." The careful approach reflected Major Freeman's understanding that high-profile civil rights cases could be derailed by premature publicity or procedural errors. Special Agent Monica Davis arrived at Fort Stewart at 0800 hours carrying a briefcase full of federal subpoenas and evidence collection orders. "Major Freeman, we're moving fast on this investigation. The Attorney General's office wants a preliminary report by Monday." The timeline was aggressive but reflected the Justice Department's recognition that the case offered an opportunity to send a clear message about civil rights enforcement. Agent Davis had spent her career prosecuting federal civil rights cases. The evidence in Major Freeman's situation was among the strongest she'd encountered. "The video documentation is extraordinary," Davis explained. "Multiple angles, clear audio, witnesses who corroborate your account completely." Major Freeman reviewed the compiled evidence with professional detachment. Her legal training helped her analyze the case objectively despite her personal involvement. Agent Davis, the pattern and practice implications are significant. Officer Sullivan's complaint history suggests systematic problems within Richmond County. Exactly. We're expanding the investigation to examine the department's entire approach to civil rights compliance. The expanded investigation meant dozens of Sullivan's previous stops would be reviewed for constitutional violations. The 17 prior complaints would be re-examined under federal scrutiny. At 0930 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes briefed Major Freeman on the military legal implications. Candace, this case has implications beyond criminal prosecution. We're looking at potential civil litigation that could establish important precedent for military-civilian relations. The civil case would proceed separately from criminal prosecution, creating multiple avenues for accountability and institutional change. Section 1983 civil rights lawsuits allowed victims of police misconduct to seek monetary damages while also obtaining court orders requiring policy changes. Ma'am, I want both criminal prosecution and civil accountability. Officer Sullivan needs to face consequences, but the department needs systematic changes. The comprehensive approach reflected Major Freeman's understanding that individual accountability alone couldn't address institutional problems. Meanwhile, Officer Sullivan was meeting with his attorney in a downtown Richmond office. The lawyer's assessment was bleak. Brett, you're facing federal civil rights charges that carry up to 10 years in prison. The evidence is overwhelming, and your client is a federal prosecutor. Sullivan had spent Thursday night watching news coverage that portrayed him as a symbol of systemic police racism. The narrative was devastating and largely accurate. His union representative had already indicated that legal defense funding would be limited. 17 prior complaints made him a liability the organization couldn't enthusiastically support. "What about pleading out?" Sullivan asked desperately. Federal prosecutors don't typically offer generous plea deals in high-profile civil rights cases. They want accountability that sends a message. The message would be that law enforcement officers couldn't violate constitutional rights without facing serious consequences. At 10:45 hours, Captain Mitchell held a press conference attempting to contain the damage to Richmond County Sheriff's Department. The assembled media crowd filled the department's small conference room and spilled into the hallway. National news networks stood alongside local reporters, all asking the same fundamental question about accountability. Captain Mitchell stepped to the podium with the uncomfortable task of defending the indefensible. Yesterday's incident is under investigation by multiple agencies. We're cooperating fully with federal authorities and conducting our own internal review. The prepared statement satisfied no one. Reporters immediately began asking specific questions about Sullivan's complaint history and department oversight procedures. "Captain, why wasn't Officer Sullivan disciplined after 17 previous complaints?" shouted a reporter from the Atlanta Constitution. "All complaints are investigated according to department procedures," Mitchell replied weakly, "but none were sustained. Doesn't that suggest problems with your investigation process?" The question exposed the fundamental flaw in police self-investigation. Departments that consistently cleared their own officers of wrongdoing lacked credibility when serious incidents occurred. Captain Mitchell attempted to deflect. "This incident is being handled by federal authorities. We'll let that investigation proceed." The deflection backfired by suggesting the department couldn't police itself and required federal intervention to address misconduct. At 11:47 hours, Major Freeman participated in a secure video conference with Justice Department officials in Washington. The participants included Assistant Attorney General Thomas Clark from the Civil Rights Division and FBI Deputy Director Susan Martinez. Major Freeman, Assistant Attorney General Clark, began, "Your case offers an opportunity to establish clear precedent about law enforcement accountability. Sir, I'm prepared to support federal prosecution fully, but I want to ensure we address systematic issues, not just individual misconduct." The statement impressed federal officials who often dealt with victims seeking only personal justice rather than institutional change. "We're considering a comprehensive approach," Clark replied. "Criminal prosecution of Officer Sullivan, plus a pattern and practice investigation of Richmond County's civil rights compliance. The dual approach would hold both individual officers and departments accountable for constitutional violations." FBI Deputy Director Martinez outlined the investigation timeline. "We want criminal charges filed within 30 days. The civil rights investigation will take longer but should produce concrete reforms." Major Freeman understood the political dynamics involved. High-profile cases required swift action to maintain public confidence in federal civil rights enforcement. At 12:15 hours, Sheriff Reynolds finally realized the full scope of his department's exposure. His legal counsel had spent the morning reviewing federal civil rights law and delivered a devastating assessment. "Tom, you're looking at potential federal oversight of the entire department. The Justice Department can force policy changes, personnel decisions, and budget allocations." Federal consent decrees had transformed police departments across the country, often requiring years of court supervision and millions in compliance costs. "What are our options?" Reynolds asked. "Cooperation and hoping for leniency. Fighting federal civil rights investigators never ends well for local departments." The political calculation was obvious. Reynolds's re-election campaign would be severely damaged by a federal investigation, but active resistance would make things worse. Reynolds decided on immediate damage control. At 13:30 hours, he announced Officer Sullivan's termination, effective immediately. The quick action was designed to demonstrate accountability and limit federal intervention. However, termination after clear misconduct was the minimum expected response, not evidence of proactive leadership. Media coverage focused on the timing. Sullivan was fired only after video evidence made his behavior indefensible, and federal prosecution became inevitable. Tiffany Brooks found herself at the center of national attention as the civilian who documented the constitutional violation. Her Instagram livestream had been viewed over 500,000 times and shared across every major social media platform. At 14:15 hours, Tiffany was interviewed by CNN's legal correspondent outside the Richmond County Courthouse. "What made you decide to start recording?" the reporter asked. Something felt wrong immediately. Officer Sullivan was aggressive from the beginning, and Major Freeman was obviously trying to de-escalate the situation professionally. Tiffany's account corroborated every element of Major Freeman's legal analysis. The civilian witness had instinctively recognized constitutional violations as they occurred. "I've never seen a police officer act like that towards someone being so respectful and cooperative," Tiffany continued. "It was obvious he was targeting her for reasons that had nothing to do with traffic violations." The interview was broadcast nationally, reaching millions of viewers and reinforcing public perception that Sullivan's actions were inexcusable. Jerome Matthews, the second witness, was providing similar testimony to federal investigators. His dash cam footage captured audio that Tiffany's phone had missed, including Sullivan's increasingly aggressive language. At 1500 hours, Major Freeman met with FBI agents for her formal victim interview. The session was recorded and transcribed for use in federal prosecution. Agent Davis led the questioning with the thoroughness required for federal civil rights cases. Major Freeman, please describe your state of mind when Officer Sullivan first approached your vehicle. I was confused by the stop because I knew I hadn't violated any traffic laws. My training told me to comply fully while documenting any irregularities. Were you concerned for your safety at any point? Yes, when Officer Sullivan became physically aggressive and grabbed my arm. His behavior was escalating beyond anything justified by the circumstances. The testimony established both constitutional violations and emotional damages that would support civil litigation. Did you identify yourself as a military officer during the encounter? I provided my name and rank when asked by Detective Bennett. I didn't volunteer military status earlier because I wanted to be treated like any civilian would be. The answer demonstrated Major Freeman's commitment to equal treatment rather than special privileges based on military service. At 16:30 hours, Colonel Harrison received a call from the Pentagon's Office of General Counsel. The case was being monitored at the highest levels of military leadership. Colonel, this incident has implications for military-civilian relations nationwide. We need to ensure proper coordination with federal prosecutors. Yes, sir. Major Freeman is handling the legal aspects professionally, while FBI coordinates the investigation. Good. The Secretary wants regular updates on prosecution progress and any policy implications for military personnel. The Pentagon's involvement reflected recognition that the case would influence how civilian police treated military members across the country. At 17:45 hours, Sheriff Reynolds held a second press conference attempting to rebuild his department's reputation. Richmond County Sheriff's Department has zero tolerance for civil rights violations. Officer Sullivan's actions do not represent our values or training. The statement rang hollow, given Sullivan's 17-complaint history and the department's failure to address prior problems. Sheriff, why should the public trust your internal investigations after this incident? Asked a reporter from the Washington Post. We're reviewing all our procedures to ensure this never happens again. That's what you said after previous complaints against Officer Sullivan. Why should this time be different? Reynolds had no satisfactory answer. His department's credibility was destroyed, and federal oversight appeared inevitable. At 18:30 hours, Major Freeman returned to her quarters on Fort Stewart to find voicemail messages from civil rights attorneys across the country offering to represent her in potential civil litigation. The offers reflected both the strength of her case and the precedent value of successful prosecution. Victory could establish important legal principles protecting military personnel from police misconduct. Major Freeman called her mentor, Colonel Martinez, to discuss the civil litigation options. Sir, I'm getting offers from some of the country's top civil rights attorneys. What's your recommendation? Focus on lawyers with federal civil rights experience who understand the broader implications beyond monetary damages. I want attorneys who will push for systematic changes, not just financial settlements. That's the right approach. This case could influence police training and military-civilian relations for decades. The long-term perspective guided Major Freeman's decision-making throughout the process. Personal justice mattered, but institutional change was equally important. At 19:15 hours, Officer Sullivan was formally charged with deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony carrying up to 10 years in prison. The charges were filed in United States District Court for the Southern District of Georgia under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, the primary federal statute for prosecuting law enforcement civil rights violations. United States Attorney Rebecca Stone announced the charges at a press conference that was broadcast nationally. Officer Sullivan's actions violated clearly established constitutional rights and betrayed the public trust. Federal prosecution sends a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated. The announcement represented the culmination of less than 24 hours of investigation, demonstrating how quickly federal prosecutors could act when evidence was overwhelming. Sullivan's attorney received the indictment at 1947 hours and immediately began preparing for what would likely be a difficult defense. The evidence was devastating. Video documentation from multiple angles, witness testimony, expert legal analysis from the victim, and a pattern of prior misconduct. Federal prosecutors rarely lost civil rights cases with such strong evidence. Sullivan's best hope was a plea agreement that might reduce his prison sentence. At 20:15 hours, Major Freeman reviewed the day's developments with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. "Ma'am, federal prosecution is moving faster than anyone expected. Criminal charges in less than 24 hours is almost unprecedented. The speed reflects both the evidence quality and Justice Department priorities," Major Freeman replied. "Civil rights enforcement sends important messages about accountability." "What about civil litigation?" "I'm meeting with attorneys next week. The civil case will focus on systematic changes to prevent future incidents." The comprehensive approach addressed both individual accountability and institutional reform. At 21:30 hours, social media analysis showed the story trending nationally across all platforms. Hashtags like Justice for Major Freeman and police accountability were generating millions of interactions. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive of prosecution and critical of police misconduct. Comment sections filled with similar stories from military personnel who'd experienced discriminatory treatment by civilian police. The broader pattern suggested Major Freeman's case represented systemic problems requiring federal intervention. At 22:45 hours, Major Freeman completed her daily situation report for Pentagon leadership. "Sir, federal prosecution is proceeding rapidly with strong evidence and witness cooperation. Media coverage is extensive but generally supportive of accountability measures." The report reflected her professional approach to a deeply personal situation. Military training had prepared her to handle crisis situations with composure and strategic thinking. Saturday morning brought continued media attention and federal investigation activity. Special Agent Davis was interviewing additional witnesses and reviewing Sullivan's complete law enforcement history. The pattern and practice investigation was expanding beyond Richmond County to examine regional trends in police misconduct and military-civilian interactions. At 0800 hours, Major Freeman met with potential civil rights attorneys at Fort Stewart's legal offices. The meeting included two of the country's most experienced federal civil rights lawyers. Major Freeman, Attorney David Thompson, began, "Your case offers an opportunity to establish important legal precedent about law enforcement accountability. I want both individual justice and systematic changes that protect future victims. We can pursue both through coordinated criminal prosecution support and comprehensive civil litigation." The strategy would maximize both personal accountability and institutional reform. Attorney Michelle Rodriguez outlined the civil case potential. Section 1983 allows us to seek monetary damages while also obtaining court orders requiring policy changes. We can force Richmond County to implement real reforms. What kind of reforms? Mandatory bias training, independent oversight of complaints, federal monitoring of traffic stops, and accountability measures for supervisors who ignore misconduct patterns. The comprehensive approach addressed root causes rather than just individual symptoms of systemic problems. Major Freeman's case was becoming a vehicle for addressing broader issues, affecting military personnel and civilian communities across the country. Federal prosecution and civil litigation would work together to establish precedent that could influence law enforcement practices nationwide. The investigation continued expanding as more evidence emerged, and additional witnesses came forward with similar experiences involving Richmond County officers. What had begun as a single traffic stop was evolving into a comprehensive examination of police accountability and civil rights protection. The federal courthouse in Savannah buzzed with media attention on Monday morning, October 14th. United States versus Brett Sullivan had drawn national coverage as a test case for law enforcement accountability. At 0830 hours, Major Candace Freeman entered the courthouse wearing her dress blue uniform, every ribbon and decoration precisely placed. The visual impact was intentional and powerful. She walked through a gauntlet of reporters and television cameras, maintaining the composed bearing that had defined her throughout the incident. No statements to media, just professional dignity under pressure. Federal prosecutor Amanda Richardson had spent 3 weeks preparing for trial. At 38, she'd prosecuted dozens of civil rights cases and recognized the significance of this one. The evidence was overwhelming, but high-profile cases created pressure to deliver justice that satisfied both legal standards and public expectations. Richardson's opening statement would focus on constitutional violations and abuse of authority. The defendant's pattern of misconduct made this case about more than a single traffic stop. Defense attorney Michael Foster faced an impossible task. His client was clearly guilty based on video evidence, but Sullivan insisted on trial rather than accepting a plea agreement. Foster's strategy involved arguing that Sullivan followed department procedures and made reasonable mistakes under pressure. The defense rang hollow, but it was all he had. Judge Patricia Morrison had been on the federal bench for 12 years and understood the broader implications of the case. Her courtroom would host a trial that could influence law enforcement practices nationwide. At 0900 hours, jury selection began. The pool included military veterans, law enforcement family members, and citizens with strong opinions about police accountability. Both sides used their challenges strategically. Prosecution wanted jurors who understood constitutional rights. Defense sought people sympathetic to law enforcement pressures. The final jury included 2 military veterans, 3 African Americans, a retired teacher, a small business owner, and 5 other citizens representing diverse backgrounds and perspectives. At 10:30 hours, Prosecutor Richardson delivered her opening statement with the confidence of someone holding overwhelming evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about the abuse of power and violation of constitutional rights. Officer Brett Sullivan targeted Major Freeman based on assumptions rather than evidence. Richardson outlined the evidence methodically. Video documentation, witness testimony, expert analysis, and Sullivan's history of similar misconduct. The defendant had no probable cause for the traffic stop, no justification for the escalation, and no grounds for arrest. Every action violated clearly established constitutional principles. The prosecution's case was built on facts that defense couldn't dispute. Multiple cameras had recorded every moment of the encounter. Defense attorney Foster's opening was brief and defensive. Officer Sullivan made split-second decisions in a challenging situation. Law enforcement requires quick judgments that look different with hindsight and slow-motion video analysis. Foster acknowledged mistakes while arguing they didn't rise to criminal violations. The strategy was weak but represented Sullivan's best hope for avoiding federal prison. At 11:15 hours, Major Freeman took the witness stand for direct examination. Her testimony would be the emotional and factual centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Prosecutor Richardson began with background questions, establishing Major Freeman's credentials and character. Major Freeman, please describe your military service and legal experience. I've served 15 years in the United States Army, including 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. I'm a judge advocate general officer, specializing in federal civil rights law and military justice. The credentials established her expertise and credibility, while highlighting the irony of Sullivan's victim selection. On September 12th, were you traveling on Highway 341 near Fort Stewart? Yes, ma'am. I was returning from a legal conference in Savannah and proceeding to Fort Stewart for a scheduled briefing. Did you commit any traffic violations during this trip? No, ma'am. I maintained posted speed limits and followed all traffic regulations. The testimony established that no legitimate grounds existed for the traffic stop. Richardson displayed video footage from multiple angles as Major Freeman narrated the events. When Officer Sullivan approached your vehicle, what was your immediate reaction? I was confused because I knew I hadn't violated any laws. My training emphasized compliance while documenting any procedural irregularities. How did Officer Sullivan's demeanor appear to you? Hostile and aggressive from the initial contact. His body language and tone suggested predetermined assumptions about my character or intentions. The professional analysis carried weight coming from someone trained in threat assessment and crisis management. When you asked about the reason for the stop, how did Officer Sullivan respond? He became increasingly agitated and demanding. Rather than explaining the traffic violation, he escalated the confrontation by ordering me from the vehicle. Did you comply with his instructions? Yes, ma'am. I exited the vehicle with my hands visible and assumed the position he requested. The testimony established complete cooperation despite Sullivan's aggressive behavior. Richardson played the audio from the encounter, amplifying Sullivan's increasingly hostile language. Major Freeman, when Officer Sullivan grabbed your arm, how did you respond? I used a defensive technique taught in military police training to break contact without escalating violence. The movement was designed to prevent injury while avoiding confrontation. Was this technique aggressive or combative? No, ma'am. It was a controlled defensive movement that any properly trained officer should have recognized as non-threatening. The expert analysis undermined Sullivan's claims about resisting arrest. How did you feel when Officer Sullivan placed you under arrest? Professionally outraged. As a federal prosecutor, I knew the arrest lacked legal foundation and violated clearly established constitutional principles. Richardson concluded direct examination by establishing damages. Major Freeman, how has this incident affected you personally and professionally? It's reinforced my commitment to civil rights enforcement, but it's also shown how easily constitutional protections can be violated when oversight systems fail. The answer focused on systemic issues rather than just personal grievance. At 13:47 hours, defense attorney Foster began cross-examination with the difficult task of challenging an expert witness whose testimony was corroborated by video evidence. Major Freeman, you'll agree that police officers must make quick decisions in potentially dangerous situations. Yes, but those decisions must be based on objective factors, not assumptions about a person's character or criminality. The answer demonstrated Major Freeman's understanding of both law enforcement challenges and constitutional requirements. Foster attempted to suggest that military bearing might have seemed threatening to Sullivan. Your military training includes combat experience, correct? Yes, but nothing in my behavior suggested threat or aggression. The video evidence clearly shows professional cooperation. Foster's strategy backfired by highlighting Major Freeman's professional qualifications and composure. Isn't it possible that Officer Sullivan genuinely believed you were being evasive or suspicious? The Fourth Amendment doesn't permit arrests based on officer feelings or assumptions. Reasonable suspicion requires objective, articulable facts. The legal analysis was devastating to Sullivan's defense. Foster concluded cross-examination quickly, recognizing that prolonged questioning would only reinforce Major Freeman's credibility and expertise. At 14:30 hours, witness Tiffany Brooks testified about her observations during the live stream. "I immediately realized something was wrong," she told the jury. Major Freeman was being respectful and cooperative, but Officer Sullivan kept escalating the situation. Brooks's civilian perspective provided important corroboration of Major Freeman's account. "What made you decide to start recording?" "The officer's behavior seemed inappropriate and potentially dangerous. I thought documentation might be important if things got worse." The instinctive decision to record had created the evidence foundation for federal prosecution. Jerome Matthews provided similar testimony about his observations, including audio captured by his dash cam. Officer Sullivan was clearly angry about something that had nothing to do with traffic violations. Matthews testified. His behavior seemed personal rather than professional. At 15:45 hours, FBI Special Agent Monica Davis testified about the investigation findings. "Agent Davis, what did your analysis reveal about Officer Sullivan's complaint history?" 17 complaints in 8 years, all involving aggressive behavior during traffic stops. The pattern showed systematic problems with his approach to law enforcement. Were any of these complaints sustained by Richmond County? None. The department consistently cleared Officer Sullivan despite documented problematic behavior. The testimony established that Sullivan's misconduct was known to supervisors who failed to address it. At 16:30 hours, legal expert Dr. Jonathan Mitchell testified about constitutional standards for traffic stops and arrests. Dr. Mitchell, did Officer Sullivan's actions violate clearly established constitutional principles? Absolutely. Every aspect of this encounter violated Fourth Amendment protections that have been clearly defined for decades. The expert testimony provided legal framework for conviction while establishing that Sullivan couldn't claim ignorance of constitutional requirements. At 17:15 hours, former Richmond County Deputy Rebecca Stone testified for the prosecution about her observations when she responded to Sullivan's backup call. "When I arrived at the scene, I immediately recognized that something was wrong with the situation," Stone testified. "What specifically concerned you?" The civilian showed no signs of combativeness or resistance. "She was cooperative and professional throughout my observations." "Why did you recommend removing the handcuffs?" "Because there was clearly no legal justification for the arrest. The situation had been mishandled from the beginning." Stone's testimony from a fellow law enforcement officer was particularly damaging to Sullivan's defense. Day 2 of trial focused on Sullivan's defense witnesses and character testimony. The effort was largely unsuccessful given the overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Sullivan's former partner testified that he was generally professional, but couldn't explain the behavior captured on video. Department training supervisors acknowledged that Sullivan's actions violated policies they'd taught him. At 10:45 hours, Sullivan himself took the stand in a desperate attempt to explain his behavior. His testimony was a disaster. Under cross-examination, he couldn't articulate legitimate grounds for the traffic stop, couldn't explain his escalating aggression, and couldn't justify the arrest. Officer Sullivan, Prosecutor Richardson asked, "What traffic violation did Major Freeman commit?" "I believed she was speeding." "But you didn't use your radar gun to verify speed, correct?" "The equipment was available, but I didn't check it." "So your belief was based on what?" Sullivan had no answer because the truth was racial profiling rather than traffic enforcement. What made you believe Major Freeman was being evasive when she asked about the reason for the stop? She seemed to be questioning my authority. Is asking about the legal basis for a police stop considered evasive behavior? Well, no, but her tone seemed challenging. The testimony revealed Sullivan's misconceptions about citizen rights and police authority. Richardson methodically destroyed Sullivan's credibility through his own admissions. Officer Sullivan, are citizens required to be deferential to police beyond basic cooperation? No, but respect for law enforcement is important. Is failure to show sufficient respect grounds for arrest? No. Then why did you arrest Major Freeman? She was resisting my commands. The video shows her complying with every instruction. Can you point to specific resistant behavior? Sullivan couldn't identify any actual resistance because none had occurred. At 14:30 hours, closing arguments began with Prosecutor Richardson summarizing the overwhelming evidence of constitutional violations. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and failure of accountability systems. Officer Sullivan targeted Major Freeman based on prejudice rather than law enforcement. Richardson recapped the evidence systematically, showing how every element of the prosecution's case had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. The defendant had no probable cause, used excessive force, made a false arrest, and violated clearly established constitutional rights. These aren't mistakes, they're crimes. Defense Attorney Foster's closing was brief and unconvincing. Officer Sullivan made errors in judgment during a stressful situation. These mistakes don't rise to criminal violations deserving federal prison. The argument ignored the video evidence and pattern of misconduct that made Sullivan's behavior clearly criminal, rather than merely mistaken. At 15:45 hours, the jury retired for deliberations. The case was so clear-cut that most observers expected a quick verdict. Major Freeman waited in the victim witness room, surrounded by military colleagues and federal prosecutors. The outcome seemed certain, but trials could surprise everyone involved. At 17:30 hours, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. On the charge of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, how do you find guilty? The courtroom erupted in applause from supporters, while Sullivan slumped at the defense table. Federal civil rights convictions were serious felonies that would end his law enforcement career permanently. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare arguments about appropriate punishment. Outside the courthouse, Major Freeman addressed the media for the first time since the incident. Justice has been served today, but this case represents broader issues about accountability and constitutional protection. Individual officers must face consequences, but departments must also change their cultures to prevent future violations. The statement focused on systematic reform rather than just personal vindication. Federal Prosecutor Richardson emphasized the precedent value. This conviction sends a clear message that law enforcement officers cannot violate civil rights without facing serious consequences. Constitutional protections apply to everyone, including military personnel. The trial's conclusion marked a significant victory for civil rights enforcement and police accountability. Officer Sullivan faced up to 10 years in federal prison. His law enforcement career was over, and his actions would be studied in police academies as examples of unconstitutional conduct. But Major Freeman understood that individual accountability was just the beginning. Systematic changes were needed to address the institutional problems that had enabled Sullivan's misconduct. The civil litigation was still pending, offering opportunities to force policy changes that would prevent future violations. federal oversight of Richmond County was under consideration, potentially requiring years of court supervision to ensure constitutional compliance. Major Freeman's case had achieved both personal justice and broader institutional change. The precedent would influence law enforcement practices and military-civilian relations for years to come. Her professional expertise had transformed a personal violation into a vehicle for systematic reform, proving that individual courage could create lasting institutional change. 6 weeks later, the federal courthouse in Savannah filled once again for Brett Sullivan's sentencing hearing. The gravity of the moment was reflected in the attendance of federal officials, military leadership, and civil rights advocates from across the region. At 0900 hours on November 28th, Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order. Federal sentencing in civil rights cases carried significant weight beyond individual punishment, sending messages about accountability and deterrence. Major Candace Freeman sat in the front row, wearing her service dress uniform, flanked by Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and Colonel Harrison. Their presence reinforced the military's commitment to seeing justice fully served. Prosecutor Amanda Richardson had prepared a comprehensive sentencing memorandum arguing for substantial prison time. Your Honor, this case involves a serious abuse of power that violated clearly established constitutional rights. The defendant's actions weren't isolated mistakes, but part of a pattern of misconduct that continued despite multiple warnings. Richardson outlined Sullivan's 17-complaint history and the department's failure to address his problematic behavior. Officer Sullivan had numerous opportunities to change his conduct. Instead, he escalated his violations until he committed federal crimes against a military officer who specializes in prosecuting exactly this type of misconduct. The irony remained one of the case's most compelling aspects. Defense attorney Foster argued for leniency based on Sullivan's family circumstances and claimed remorse. Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan is a father of 2 young children who depends on his income. He's expressed genuine regret for his actions and lost his career already. The argument for mercy rang hollow, given the severity of the violations and Sullivan's refusal to accept responsibility during trial. Judge Morrison invited victim impact statements, beginning with Major Freeman herself. Your Honor, this incident reinforced why civil rights enforcement remains essential in American society. Officer Sullivan's actions weren't isolated mistakes, but symptoms of systematic problems that require serious consequences. Major Freeman's statement was measured and focused on institutional issues rather than personal grievance. Individual accountability is important, but meaningful change requires recognition that constitutional violations damage entire communities. Federal prosecution sends a message that such behavior will not be tolerated. Tiffany Brooks also provided impact testimony about her role as a civilian witness. Your Honor, watching Major Freeman being treated that way made me realize how often these incidents occur without documentation. I was lucky to be there with my phone, but countless other violations go unrecorded. Her perspective highlighted the broader implications beyond this single case. Jerome Matthews emphasized the community impact of police misconduct. This incident damaged trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Only serious accountability can begin to repair that damage. At 10:30 hours, Judge Morrison announced her sentencing decision. Mr. Sullivan, your actions represented a serious abuse of power that violated the constitutional rights of a distinguished military officer. The evidence showed deliberate misconduct rather than honest mistakes. Sullivan stood as the judge continued her analysis. Your pattern of complaints and aggressive behavior demonstrates that this incident wasn't isolated. You had multiple opportunities to change your conduct, but continued violating citizen rights. The judge paused before announcing the sentence. "I hereby sentence you to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from law enforcement employment and must complete community service focused on civil rights education." The sentence was substantial, but not the maximum possible. It reflected both the severity of Sullivan's crimes and the judge's recognition of the precedent being established. Sullivan's family members wept in the gallery as he was led away in handcuffs. His law enforcement career was over, and his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. Outside the courthouse, Major Freeman addressed the media with her characteristic professionalism. "Justice has been served today with a sentence that reflects the seriousness of constitutional violations. But individual accountability is only part of the solution." She announced the next phase of her legal strategy. "I'm proceeding with civil litigation to force systematic changes that will prevent future violations. Richmond County must implement reforms that protect all citizens from discriminatory treatment." The civil case, filed 3 weeks earlier, sought both monetary damages and comprehensive policy changes. Attorney David Thompson represented Major Freeman in the Section 1983 lawsuit against Richmond County Sheriff Reynolds and Sullivan personally. "Our civil complaint addresses the institutional problems that enabled Officer Sullivan's misconduct," Thompson explained to reporters. "We're seeking court orders requiring bias training, independent oversight of complaints, and accountability measures for supervisors who ignore patterns of misconduct." The civil litigation would take longer than criminal prosecution, but offered opportunities for lasting institutional change. Richmond County faced potential damages in the millions, along with court-ordered reforms that could reshape the department's operations. At 1200 hours, Colonel Harrison held a press conference at Fort Stewart, addressing the broader implications for military-civilian relations. Major Freeman's case demonstrates why federal civil rights enforcement remains essential. Military personnel deserve the same constitutional protections as all American citizens. Harrison announced new policies requiring military legal review of any civilian police incidents involving Fort Stewart personnel. "We're implementing coordination protocols to ensure that any future incidents receive immediate attention from appropriate authorities." The military's response reflected recognition that proactive measures were needed to prevent similar problems. Sheriff Reynolds, facing re-election in 6 months, announced his own reform package, attempting to rebuild department credibility. Richmond County is implementing comprehensive policy changes to prevent future civil rights violations, Reynolds told reporters. The reforms included mandatory bias training, body cameras for all officers, an independent review of citizen complaints. However, many observers noted that these changes came only after federal intervention and public pressure rather than proactive leadership. At 14:15 hours, FBI Special Agent Davis briefed federal officials on the pattern and practice investigation results. "Our review of Richmond County found systematic problems with complaint investigation, officer training, and supervisory oversight," Davis reported. The investigation revealed that Sullivan's behavior was enabled by institutional failures rather than isolated to one problematic officer. "We're recommending federal monitoring to ensure that promised reforms are actually implemented and sustained over time." Federal oversight would continue for several years, ensuring accountability beyond the immediate crisis response. The Department of Justice announced broader policy implications of Major Freeman's case. Assistant Attorney General Thomas Clark issued a statement emphasizing federal commitment to civil rights enforcement. United States v. Sullivan establishes clear precedent that law enforcement officers cannot violate constitutional rights without facing serious consequences. Federal prosecutors will continue pursuing such cases aggressively. The precedent would influence prosecutorial decisions and police behavior nationwide. At 15:30 hours, Major Freeman returned to Fort Stewart to brief Pentagon officials on the case's resolution and ongoing implications. Ma'am, how should military installations coordinate with civilian law enforcement given the risks highlighted by your case? Asked an officer from Fort Bragg. Proactive communication and clear protocols, Major Freeman replied. Both sides need to understand their respective authorities and responsibilities. The discussion led to new military-civilian coordination policies being developed at the national level. 3 months later, the civil case reached settlement negotiations. Richmond County faced overwhelming evidence of constitutional violations and the prospect of years of federal court supervision. Attorney Thompson presented the county's legal team with a comprehensive settlement proposal. We're seeking $2.3 million in damages, plus court-ordered reforms including independent complaint investigation, mandatory bias training, and federal monitoring for 5 years. The financial settlement reflected both punitive damages for constitutional violations and compensation for Major Freeman's professional and personal harm. More importantly, the institutional reforms would create lasting changes, preventing future incidents. County commissioners faced a difficult choice between expensive settlement or even more costly federal oversight through contested litigation. At 1600 hours on March 15th, Richmond County agreed to the comprehensive settlement, making it one of the largest civil rights settlements in Georgia history. The agreement included financial compensation for Major Freeman and mandated systematic reforms addressing institutional problems. Independent oversight of citizen complaints would be handled by a civilian review board with investigative authority. Mandatory bias training became required for all officers, with annual recertification and federal monitoring of compliance. Body cameras were installed for all patrol officers, with footage subject to random federal review. Statistical monitoring of traffic stops would identify patterns suggesting discriminatory enforcement. Community advisory panels would provide ongoing civilian input on department policies and practices. The settlement represented exactly the kind of institutional change Major Freeman had sought from the beginning. At 1700 hours, Major Freeman held her final press conference on the case, announcing the settlement and its implications. This agreement ensures that my experience leads to systematic changes protecting all citizens from discriminatory treatment, she told assembled reporters. Individual accountability was important, but institutional reform creates lasting protection for entire communities. The comprehensive approach had achieved both personal justice and broader social change. 6 months later, Major Freeman was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the Pentagon's Civil Rights Division, where her expertise would influence military policy at the national level. Her case had become a model for federal civil rights enforcement and military-civilian coordination. Brett Sullivan served his federal prison sentence and was released after 3 years. He was prohibited from law enforcement employment and required to complete extensive community service. His case became a standard example in police academies of how constitutional violations destroy careers and damage entire departments. Richmond County implemented all required reforms under federal monitoring. Statistical analysis showed dramatic improvements in citizen complaint rates and community satisfaction with police services. Sheriff Reynolds lost his re-election campaign, with voters choosing a reform candidate who promised continued accountability and constitutional policing. The new sheriff, Detective Laura Bennett, had been promoted after her professional handling of Major Freeman's case investigation. Tiffany Brooks used her social media platform to document police accountability efforts across the country, becoming a recognized advocate for citizen oversight. Jerome Matthews joined Richmond County's Civilian Review Board, bringing his witness experience to formal oversight responsibilities. 1 year after sentencing, Major Freeman addressed the National Conference of Federal Prosecutors about civil rights enforcement. Individual cases matter because they establish precedent and demonstrate federal commitment to constitutional protection, she told the assembled prosecutors. But lasting change requires systematic approaches that address institutional problems rather than just individual misconduct. Her case had influenced federal prosecution priorities and police department policies across the country. Training academies used the Sullivan case as an example of how assumptions and bias could lead to career-ending criminal violations. Military installations nationwide implemented coordination protocols based on lessons learned from the Fort Stewart incident. Civil rights attorneys cited Major Freeman's precedent in dozens of subsequent cases involving law enforcement misconduct. Federal judges referenced the case when considering appropriate sentences for constitutional violations by police officers. The ripple effects extended far beyond Richmond County and Fort Stewart, influencing law enforcement practices and civil rights protection nationwide. 2 years later, Major Freeman was interviewed by the Harvard Law Review about the case's long-term implications. The most important lesson is that individual courage can create institutional change when supported by strong legal frameworks and community advocacy, she reflected. My case succeeded because multiple systems worked together: federal prosecution, civil litigation, military support, witness documentation, and community pressure. No single approach would have been sufficient, but comprehensive accountability achieved lasting reform. 5 years after the incident, Richmond County had been transformed from a department with chronic civil rights problems to a model for constitutional policing. Federal monitoring had ended after successful completion of all reform requirements. Community satisfaction with police services had increased dramatically. Officer complaint rates had dropped by 67%. Use of force incidents declined by 52%. Community engagement initiatives had rebuilt trust between police and citizens. The transformation demonstrated that systematic reform could succeed when supported by federal oversight and community involvement. Major Freeman's case had proven that individual incidents of injustice could become catalysts for broader social change when handled with strategic vision and comprehensive legal action. Her expertise as a JAG officer had transformed a personal violation into a vehicle for institutional reform that protected countless future victims. The precedent established by United States v. Sullivan continued influencing civil rights enforcement and police accountability efforts across the country. Real-life stories like Major Freeman's prove that courage and expertise can overcome institutional indifference when combined with federal civil rights enforcement. Her case reminds us that individual actions matter, but lasting change requires systematic approaches that address root causes rather than just symptoms. Every citizen has the right to constitutional protection from law enforcement misconduct. Major Freeman's case established precedent, ensuring that federal prosecutors would continue defending those rights aggressively. What injustices have you witnessed in your community? How can individual courage create institutional change? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your voice matters in building communities where everyone receives equal protection under law. Subscribe for more real-life stories proving that justice and accountability can overcome discrimination and abuse of power. Together we create a society where constitutional rights are protected for everyone, regardless of race, profession, or social status.